BookTube. It's day 6 of E.V. Lucas's essays. Edward Vera Lucas is Domesticities, published in 1900. This is essay concerning catalogues. And I'll read the first paragraph here. At a time when too much is done for the inassiduous roving reader, when the tendency is entirely toward frangible, even friable reading matter, one hesitates to commend to those that love literature the merits of catalogues. And yet a catalogue, a thing that costs nothing, a thing rescued possibly from the wastepaper basket, may be more stimulative of pleasant thought and fancy, may launch the mind on longer and more eventful voyages across the seas of memory, than can many an expensive and well-bound book. The catalogue itself is nothing. Its strength is in its profusion of suggestions, of potentialities, of words that stand for facts. One is continually reminded. Reminded of what? Of 1,000 things. And Lucas goes on to first start with Rose Catalogues. And I believe he's writing this from a December point of view, that a catalogue of roses, the tender poetry, the rich extravagance, the warm enthusiasm of a rose grower's list cannot miscarry. And he goes on to name a rose and then its description. However, I do apologize, butcher the names of these roses, but I'll do my best. Abel Carey, and he quotes, dark velvety crimson with fiery red center, perfect form, handsome foliage. And the Alfred Collinib, brilliant light, scarlet crimson, large, full and globular, a magnificent rose of superb shape, even fragrant, and very fragrant. And he just goes on and quotes a number of roses, and then he wonders, because it's mostly French names for the roses, and he wonders, what must one do for one's own name to be whispered in the coming ages by the breath of a rose? In imperial action to conquer the Sudan would seem to be not enough, for there is no bloom, fresh flowering, or rampant, velvety, or superb known as Lord Kitchener. However, he does note that there is a Sir Herbert Kitchener chrysanthemum, and it's described as a very large Japanese with very broad florets, bright golden chestnut bronze, with gold and amber reverse florets, long and drooping, forming a very deep and graceful flower, one of the grandest novelties of the season. But the rose, no, there is no rose. He asks, how does one commend one's name to the grower of roses? One apparently need not be a professed lover of the flower, and he mentions there's a Charles Lamb rose, who cared little for the garden, but he has the honor of being called, rose named after him, and it's described as a soft cherry rose, very bright, and he says, which sounds more like Leigh Hunt. So that's Lucas with his little humorous parts. And he also says there's a Socrates who, again, wasn't a rose, but who preferred hemlock, he says. The Socrates is described as coppery brown shaded with pink. There's a Lord Macaulay, variable form, scarlet crimson to rich plum. There's a Lord Bacon, deep crimson shaded with velvety black blossoming abundantly. There's a Charles Darwin, a rich brownish crimson, perfectly reflexed and imbricated. There's even a John Stuart Mill, but he notes that there's no Shakespeare, no Thackeray, especially no Waller. He notes that among the living, the honor is given to royalty, and he talks about his authors are not recognized until they're dead, and then he says some of the sweetest names for roses are French. I will attempt a couple, but that's about it, because I know, again, I'll be butchering them. Souvenir de Malmaison, Camille de Rohan, Marshall Neal, Dupuy Jamin, and so on. He names quite a few. Then he moves on to another catalog, or a type of catalog. He says, so also will be the pages of cricket outfitters' lists. But whereas the poetry of the Rose list is lyric, that of the Wisdens is epic. And he mentions about getting through his postbox a copy of Wisden's illustrated catalog, which is a wonderful array of old, scarred, and honorable bats. And they stand in eloquent pairs, two couples on the page. They are cracked and splintered and pegged and bound, and on each is a short and simple testimony of some mighty cricketer. And the first one he notes is, the best bat I ever used. 6 words, written by the cricketer George Ulliott of Sheffield, and it's about a Crawford's patent Excelsior. Then he turns to a Yorkshire cricketer who is a bit more verbose, I would say. He said, this old bat has done wonderful service. I played with it both with Lord Sheffield's and Mr. Stoddard's teams, and 3 summers at home. It was the best bat I ever played with. In first-class cricket alone, more than 3,500 runs must have been made from it. And then Lucas says, and now it sits idle, resting until the day of dissolution. And he says the writer of these words is Johnny Briggs. And he talks, and then he goes to turning again Brown's gravedigger is before us. The bat with which Brown of Driffield made his 140 for Mr. Stoddard's Australian team in 1895. And then it notes, the catalogue notes that Brown often has a look at the bat when he's in London. And Lucas says, had it been mine, and my runs, it should never have left my possession. But cricketers are more generous than ordinary persons, he says. Then he goes on to mention a number of catalogs. Well, this was kind of interesting. It's not so much a catalog, but he goes on to mention sort of there are novels in halfpenny papers more interesting in the synopsis than the narrative, and there are many stories more notable in their chapter headings than in themselves. And he notes Ainsworth's, for example, I never tire of reading his full-bodied premise, how Queen Mary visited the Lion's Tower, how Magog gave his dame a lesson, and how Zeit conquered a monkey and was worsted by a bear, and continues how the Princess Elizabeth was confronted by Thomas Wyatt in the torture chambers. And he says, these are very interesting, but with the text of the Tower of London, I feel certain, done forever. And then he talks about also pleasure may come from a table of contents in a collection of poetry, but particularly from an index of first names. And he remembers picking up a book, and Mr. Buller's one of Mr. Bullen's volumes, lyrics from the songbooks of the Elizabethan age, and he says that it's sort of a leveling. Basically, he says it's a leveling force, where you list the first names, so the great and not so great are set side by side. And then he goes on to talk about basically sales type catalogs. He mentions it's in the bazaar, the Exchange and Mart, and it's like a flourishing rose on an insignificant Manetti stack. The supplement parts puts forth the blossoms, while the parent unobtrusively avoids the eye. These blossoms have a variety of which one cannot tire. Advertisements from every part of the United Kingdom meet there to accommodate each other. Magic lanterns are offered for guinea pigs, bicycles as good as new for sitting hens, complete sets of the penny encyclopedias for double-barreled guns, old Broadwoods for young spaniels. One need require nothing oneself to find the prettiest amusements in the amongst them all. And it says, on a railway journey, one reads and reads, and he thinks this is just perfect for a railway journey, that you could take it, reading from beginning to end, the Exchange and Mart, and you could go from St. Pancras to York, or from Exeter to Paddington, from London Bridge to Charing Cross. And he says it's the best railway reading. I can delight in it when I cannot read Mr. Herbert Spencer. And he also talks about country life, and going through sales of houses, grand houses, and you could just sort of take off, no, there's too much, it's too overgrown. I don't much care for that gable, and so you can just pretend in your mind of purchasing these houses or not purchasing them because of certain reasons. And then he talks about another one called the Amateur Trader, and it's a periodical catalog of curiosities which Miss Millard of Teddington prepares for her clients in a work of astounding individuality, he says. With sweet variety, your taste I'll please, is Miss Millard's motto and achievement. The copy of the Amateur Trader, which I quote from, has, by way of coy preface, some of the compliments which have been paid to its strenuous editor. A Viennese gentleman says, your brilliant talents. A New York collector says there is a snap and earnestness about your communication and catalog, not a usual characteristic. And a Lancashire lady says your letters are delightful reading, marvels of style, dictation, even grace, and may I add, erudition. And it just goes on. Yeah, it's just and he quotes quite long sections here for instance, a sampler, a small lot of pretty specimens of late last and early this century, of more or less quaint designs, the work of several childish fingers. In handling these samplers, one must confess to a tender and pathetic feeling in having the poet's words vividly brought to mind, and quotes, long laid to rest the patient's hands that played with formal time, and faded are the silken strands, and sad and shallow chimes. Sorry, it's just the lighting's bad here, and I'm having difficulty seeing this for some reason. And then she quotes the price, but yeah, I think you get the gist of that anyway. So prices may vary half a guinea to a guinea. And he quotes another longer one, but then he says, and then he talks about one that's definitely is pages of a second-hand books with passages from, and he like he mentions one, Mr. Bertram Doble's catalog, and he says he puts at the end passages from his reading and tender little poems of his own, composing even translations from Heine and three-line prettiness in a Japanese measure called a haiku. But catalogs, to be on occasion the best possible reading, do not actually need much embellishment. A book catalog, indeed, is self-sufficient. And he talks about the catalogs of Mr. Quirich. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but Bernard Quirich was a bookseller. He was German-born and came to the UK. Started a bookshop in the late 1840s, I believe, and then started issuing catalogs within the next decade. He was born in the early, 1819 or something like that, and he died basically at the turn of the 20th century, 1888 or 1899. Passed the business on to his son. But the thing is, it's still going. There's a Bernard Quirich bookshop in London as well. I believe he started it in Leicester. I'm not sure if it's still there, but he started his bookshop in Leicester, and he just Lucas just raves about his books, and having actually not bought particularly from his catalog, but likes reading them, and he goes on, just to say that. Let me see here. What's good the part to read to end it off with? Just say here. Yes, it says just that a mild, well-ordered inclination to add sauce to the perusal may be this, but nothing more. He must be utterly without rancor, that others are richer than he. And he's just talking about without being able to read the catalogs, and you can basically just tick off and buy all the first folios you want, sort of virtually. We would say virtually shopping now. But that's Lucas's concerning catalogs. I do apologize it went a little bit longer, but it was a bit longer essay. And again, I apologize for butchering the French names of the roses. But next one is concerning clothes is the next essay. And since I am doing this one for Saturday, number 6, I will do number 7 tomorrow. So we're just over the halfway mark now. And I hope everybody's doing well and have a good weekend. Enjoy your reading. And I will say again, Happy World Poetry Day. Take care, all.